Welcome. I'm Rachel Clark from Youthworx Pathways Program, and I'm here to deliver the final of a four-part session called Getting Ready for Work. But before that, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and waterways in the area now known as Moreland, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people. We pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging, as well as all First Nations communities who contribute to the life of the area and are present with us today. Welcome all. So, as I said, this is the fourth of a four-part series called Getting Ready for Work. So that program is part of the Youthworx training program that I'm involved with, running and working with our young people who are in our classrooms learning media skills. My role is to support them with their employment experience. So the previous three sessions can be viewed on the Moreland Library's Facebook page and YouTube channels, and I really encourage you to check those out. So we previously covered employers, we looked at resumes, and we looked at interviews. So we've covered a lot. This session is about workers' rights and responsibilities. Hey Jessa, welcome back. Nice to see you again. All right, so the way that we'll run this session is that I will be covering the two areas of worker rights and worker responsibilities. So worker rights, we're going to be looking at where they come from and why they're so important and what they look like today. And worker responsibilities, well, we're looking at the two types of worker responsibilities, the role-related responsibilities that you may well be really familiar with, but also the personal and financial responsibilities that come with having a job. So there will be time for questions after each section. Please feel free to type your questions in the chat box as you go. If you want to remember them, as I'm saying something, you want to ask me a question, I'll check them frequently. So let's begin. Being a worker carries many rights, as it should do. Also, it carries responsibilities. So this session is really getting us to think about why it's important to know these before you start a job, or even if you're in a job now, so that not only can you look after yourself, but other people whilst you're at work. So that's what our session is going to cover. We're going to start with where workers' rights have come from and why they are so important. Well, does anybody enjoy Labour Day on Monday? Because Labour Day is the hard won protesting of stonemasons in Melbourne in 1856 who downed their tools to stop working in protest of working long hours. And their protest eventually led to the 1916 8 Hours Act. They said that they wanted to only work 8 hours, so they had 8 hours work, 8 hours rest, 8 hours play. And that really laid the groundwork for us all being able to enjoy work-life balance as much as we possibly can. There's lots of things that you can learn about that, but it's really interesting. So yeah, explore that further. Just a note also, I will be putting resources available for all of these sessions. We'll be doing that via the Moreland Library's website, Facebook page, and there'll be links to all of these really interesting bits of information as we go through. So yeah, we have the stonemasons in Melbourne, of Melbourne in 1856 to thank for our Labour Day, which we experienced this Monday, and we had a public holiday to celebrate the fact that as workers we've gained rights. So isn't that wonderful? So why are these rights so important? Well, they protect our wages and our work conditions, and legislation like the 1916 8 Hour Act has been put in place, and it continues to be put in place to ensure that we're paid fairly for the work done and our labour is not taken advantage of, and that we have access to leave entitlements. And these sorts of leave entitlements change and shift as culture shifts. So it's super interesting and really relevant to us as workers that we know what the legislation protects us, so that we know what our leave entitlements are, and we'll be covering that a little bit more later. And also they're incredibly important because we should be able to be safe at work. So in days gone by, people were not safe at work. They might have got injured or they might have died as a result of unsafe work practices. And really legislation has supported people to not have those experiences as much now through protection at work. So yeah, they're super important, workers' rights, and there are lots of advocates for them, and we'll talk about that as we go through. So before I proceed, are there any questions at this stage? So you can type them as you go along, of course. So what do workers' rights look like today? Because we talked about the stonemasons back in history, but what do they look like today? Well, I want you to remember 7 areas, right? 7 areas. There's a lot of information in this content, so you can go back and watch the recording another time, but let's start with number 1. So you should receive a formal contract and or letter of offer. Okay, so that states what you have been offered as work, and it also gives you information about what your work role looks like, and what you can refer back to it should things change as you go through your work role, experiencing your work role. So what are the differences between a letter of offer and a contract? Well, a letter of offer is typically a shorter document with very basic details outlining intended employment engagement. So it might have your position, it will have your position, the type of employment, casual, part-time, that type of stuff, ongoing, company name, terms and conditions that are part of your contract, which is often attached to a letter of offer. Okay, so your contract is more detailed and including, and you can get details of this, lots of places you can Google to get more description of what should be included in a contract, but these are the areas that would normally be included or should be included. A clear job description, yeah, so you know exactly what your role entails and you can be judged by whether you've done what the job entails. That's often called a position description or a PD as well, right? So they'll have your tasks that you should be doing for the payment that you're getting. Okay, it will also include your salary or wage details, superannuation, any overtime, any bonuses, any allowances that are relevant, right? So that will be detailed in your contract as well. The nature of your employment, you know, are you full-time, part-time, casual, ongoing, yeah, base, time limited. Your reporting structure, who you report to, so that you know who you're accountable to. Any leave entitlements that you may have. So you might need to work for the organisation for a certain amount of time before you can take annual leave, for example. Confidentiality or protection of intellectual property depends on your industry. Some industries are very protective of information that they hold. So any details about that will be included in contracts. The termination process, you know, what to expect if your job ends or could end. Similarly, a dispute resolution process if there is a problem that needs to be managed. So you can see a contract is more detailed. And of course, if you have that, you keep hold of that and you refer back to that, that gives you a sense of your entitlements, right? It also talks to the things that you're responsible for, but it talks to the areas that you have rights in. Okay, that's your first area. Make sure you get your contract and letter of offer or letter of offer. Number 2, that you need to make sure that you're paid for all the hours you work, right? So it makes sense, doesn't it? How do you remember? Maybe your hours vary. Well, make sure you keep a record of your own hours and then compare those to your pay slip, right? So ensure that you're getting paid. Sometimes you think, oh, that's less than I expected. But actually, if you've kept a log and then you've looked at your payslip, which is the next point, then you can be sure that you are actually being paid for the hours that you're working. So the third area is you should get a payslip, right? You should receive a payslip, sometimes called a wage slip, a document issued by your employer that lists details about your pay. Now, it's going to tell you about the details of your pay before tax, as well as any deductions, right? The details also, it will tell you that how much you've earned over a pay period and a year to date. And it of course will tell you how much you actually receive, which is your net pay, which is after tax. All right, so make sure you get your pay slip, because then you can check that you've been paid for all the hours that you've worked. And if you haven't, then you can go to your boss or your HR department and query it, right? You must make sure that you're paid for the hours that you work. Well, this leads on to the 4th area, which is getting the right pay. Right? You need to make sure that the pay that you're being paid is the right scale, but also, yeah, the right amount in the end. And what you need to know about this is gross and net income. Okay, so gross income is the total pay you earn from your employer or clients before taxes and other deductions, right? So that'll be the biggest amount. Your net income refers to the amount that you take home into your bank account after all the taxes and deductions have been taken out, right? So you may think you're entitled to your gross pay, but actually your net pay is your entitlement because we have to pay taxes as well. Heidi says, what happens if I've gone to my boss and she still doesn't give me pay slips? That's a good question, Heidi. I'm not sure about that. It is an entitlement, right? So maybe let's assume the best. Let's assume that my boss is overwhelmed with paperwork and has changed systems and it takes some time to get an appropriate system up and running. Give her the benefit of the doubt. If after a reminding that still doesn't come forward, then I would imagine that you'd need to go to Fair Work and lodge a complaint. Delicate areas, right? But you do have entitlements and rights, and we'll come to some of those places that you can get support for this sort of matter. You might also want to speak with your union. We'll come to that. Great question. All right, so we're now on the fifth area of your rights. Okay, we've looked at contracts, we've looked at pay, getting paid the right amount for the hours, getting paid the entitlements, and making sure that you know what it is that you are taking home in your bank account at the end of each month. All right, number five, getting trained. It is your right to be suitably trained for the role that you're undertaking, right? So it might be issues of health and safety and well-being for yourself and other people if you don't have access to the right training. So you should have access to relevant industry, current and wonderful, thanks Heidi, relevant and current industry training as part of your paid hours paid for by your employer. Well, some employers are more able or more generous or more more able to offer you paid training. You should get the training you need to be able to do the job safely. So training should be part of your induction, right? You may work in an industry where training is highly valued, and you might then be given opportunities to attend free training that you don't have to pay for, but you might have to do it in your own time. So it's always a balance, right? You absolutely should be trained to ensure that you can do your work safely. You might have to have qualifications coming into the work anyway that shows that you're trained up to a certain standard. But if there's a specific technique, like for example, operating a piece of machinery that you haven't had previous experience, you absolutely should be trained to do that safely. But then there might be additional training areas in which you have options to access training. Your employer might pay for it, it might be free training offered. Really good opportunity to take up as much training as possible. Enhances your resume for a start. Okay, that was number 5, getting trained up so that you're safely able to do the work that you are being paid to do. This is the 6th area, know your rights. And this is really where it comes to, knowing where to go, such as Fair Work Ombudsman and the Fair Work Commission. And these are government organisations, independent. The Fair Work Ombudsman is an independent organisation, but you can see it's part of the Australian government overarching service structure. Lots of information on those websites. They can link you to the relevant legislation as well, such as the Fair Work Act 2009 or the Work Health and Safety Act 2011. Reading legislation isn't as boring as it sounds. I quite enjoy it, but then maybe I'm odd. It gives you, it's not terribly, let me know if anybody else enjoys reading legislation in the chat. They're quite easy to read, they're not very long, and they tell you exactly what you're entitled to. I think it's a great way of getting connected to your rights. But you can also, of course, go to websites like Fair Work and also WorkSafe Victoria, Victorian Equal Opportunities and Human Rights Commission, for example. They'll give you a summary of your rights, and they'll also walk you through any processes that they, thanks, that's wonderful, that they can support you with. So they might be able to take a case on a case of unfair dismissal or inappropriate pay arrangements, as we've discussed previously. So they are there to support workers. They are also there to support employers. So, they want the best outcome for the two parties coming together. So definitely know the legislation, know where you can go to get support as the organisations that we're showing up here. And similarly, know about your leave entitlements, right? So they will be detailed in those organisations. Know how much an average worker has entitlement to holiday leave, to sick leave, to carers leave, to family violence leave, to parental leave, to compassionate leave. There are all these different types of leave that have been fought for and are now legislated, and you have a right to them. So know what your rights are. And those organisations that we've put up in the chat section will give you all the information you need to know on leave entitlements. So you need to type in leave entitlements. You also have a right to say no to work that you cannot do that is beyond your contract, and without being penalised for it. So often we want to say yes to more work, but at times it's not available or possible or appropriate for us, and we do have a right to say no if it is beyond our contractual obligations. Finally, knowing your rights around poor behaviour. You shouldn't be subject to bullying or harassment or discrimination in your workplace. These are protected attributes of being a citizen of Australia, that we shouldn't be harassed and vilified for our race or our gender or our sexual orientation, etc., etc. And there are other legislation that cover that, but similarly, the Victorian Equal Opportunities and Human Rights Commission, WorkSafe Victoria, Fair Work Commission will support you and step you through a process if you feel that you're being exposed to poor behaviour that is unsafe, physically, emotionally, psychologically. So number 6, know your rights. There's a fair bit of homework to do there, isn't there? Yeah. Number 7, this is an extension of who can support you. So get support and stand together with unions. So you can join a union. A union is many unions. In fact, there are over 46 affiliated unions and 8 trades and labour councils. They are organisations that work across industry to work on behalf of workers. Amazing organisations. Some examples of them would be the Education Union, the AEU, Musicians Union of Australia, the Community and Public Sector Union, CPSU. You'll often hear them in acronyms. Unions support workers by advocating for pay increases, and they frequently win them. So when you get a raise, that's because a union has advocated for it, right? It's not because the employer has thought, time for a raise. Most likely it's because a union has advocated for it. Or they might provide case support work if there's a dispute between you, an employee or an employer. So Heidi asks, is there a list of unions online? How do I find the right union? Yeah, so if you go to Fair Work, there is a list, and I'll put this in the research, in the supplementary information. There is a list of unions, and it goes according to industry. Quite fascinating. So if you're a baker or a musician or a teacher or a plumber, there will be a union that's aligned to your industry area. And you can also Google your profession and union, and it will probably come up with it. But definitely Fair Work is a place to go to get that list of unions or trades and labour councils. All right, any other questions? So those are our 7 areas of workers' rights and what they look like today. Okay, I might move on to, wonderful, thank you so much, Heidi. I might move on now to worker responsibilities. So we've talked about worker rights. Now let's move on to worker responsibilities. With rights come responsibilities. You've probably heard that phrase before, possibly at school, possibly within your family, or yeah, they go together. So worker responsibilities are twofold. They are to do with the job that we hold, the work that we're paid to do, so role-related responsibilities that, I need to produce X number of things a month, or I need to teach this number of students, etc., etc. They also fall into additional responsibilities that you have as an employed person who gets paid for your work. Okay, so let's look at number one first, your role-related responsibilities. Well, this is where your position description will outline what's expected of you in your job role as a whole. And really important that you have access to your job description, position description, job role, any of those things, they're all the same thing, with your list of activities that you must do and that you will be judged against how well you do. That you have access to that so that you are able to prove what a good worker you are, what a good employee you are. Okay, so that's one area. You'll also have maybe a work plan, depends on your industry, or some key performance indicators that you might have to deliver to. Again, areas that you're judged against, so that you have to explain what you've been doing in the time that you've been working. So that might be in the form of a work plan or a whole series of other documents. Might be Gantt charts if you're in project management, etc. It might also be in the form of roster when you're on duty, and clearly when you need to show up and be there and be paid for it. So those are role-related responsibilities that are going to keep you on the straight and narrow with your job, doing the right thing, showing up, and getting paid for what you do because you're doing your job. The second area is more detailed, that you have to be really aware of, and it does really fall into categories of people that are employed. So you have an employer, and the employer does all sorts of things for you, and people that are self-employed, and you're responsible for a whole lot of stuff. All right, but I'm going to talk about those two groups together at the start. All right, so in this section here, which is about personal and financial responsibilities as a worker, all workers are responsible for paying tax, right? So when we are paid for our work, we are also responsible for paying tax to the government. That's how they build new hospitals and how they pave new roads, is through our tax. How much tax we pay depends on how much we earn, right? If you've heard the phrase tax-free threshold, quite difficult to say, that is $18,200 per year per annum. PA stands for per annum, which means per year. So you can earn up to $18,200 without being taxed at all. So that's good. Once you start earning above $18,200 per annum, you start paying tax. Now you should know how much you're being paid. That's part of your responsibility to inform yourself. You can find that out by going to the Australian Tax Office to learn about the tax brackets. Okay, again, all of this will be detailed in the resources that we will make available. So Heidi asks, is there a minimum number of hours an employee can work? How much warning should an employer give if asking you to come in last minute? I actually don't know the answer to that, Heidi. Does anybody else know in the group? Yeah, it's not something I could answer without Googling it. It's a great question though. So I'm going to move on to paying super. So you're also, as a worker, responsible for gathering, thank you, that was something else, gathering superannuation so that you can retire. It's a savings plan for your retirement. So actually you don't have to pay super, but you won't have money at the end of it to end of your working life to retire on. So for example, if you're employed, your employer will collect that amount and pay it on your behalf. So it's their responsibility. So you have that superannuation building up. But if you are a self-employed individual, it's your responsibility to pay into a super fund. Nobody's going to make sure you do that, but you won't have money to live on at the end of your working life when you're retired. So that's really important. So superannuation is an area in which you need to be proactive and aware of. And there are different industry superannuation funds, and you can read about different types of super. You can choose which fund you opt into as well. That's a choice that you have. But I'll certainly link those to information in the resource booklet as well around how you choose. You also must have a tax file number, also called a TFN, tax file number, to pay tax, right? So all workers, especially when you're at school, it's one of the first things you do before you go on work experience. You have to apply for a tax file number or a TFN, and that stays with you through your working life. That's a way that you are connected to the amount of tax that you've paid, right? So you can do that by going to the Australian Taxation Office, the ATO, and it's a simple form to apply for a TFN. Doesn't cost anything, it's easy to do. So if you don't have a tax file number, you need to get one. Okay, coming into the final section of this. So if you are an employed person, right, then as an employee of an organisation, your employer will take tax from your salary and also will make super contributions on your behalf. Okay, so you don't need to do anything. You might need to choose a super fund. There usually is a default super fund if you don't make an active choice, but you can, as I've said, choose your super fund. They will pay tax and super on your behalf. You have to do nothing, right? They take it out. That's what the income, that's what the amount, that's why it's larger at the beginning of your, in your tax pay slip, and then you get less at the end because tax and super has been taken out on your behalf. You will be able to see how much tax you're paying and how much your super contribution is on your pay slips. Okay. Again, you can go to the Australian Taxation Office to find out more about working as an employee. Lots of interesting information there. If you're self-employed, you may choose to be self-employed because it gives you flexibility, and for some industries it's the way to go, right? In creative industries, maybe all sorts of industries, you might choose to be building industry, etc. You might choose to be self-employed. Well, then you are then responsible for your tax contributions, and that comes under a system called PAYG, which is pay as you go, and you can find out all sorts of things about that by going to, again, the ATO and learning about PAYG. That's if you're self-employed. Okay, if you're self-employed, you'll also need an Australian business number, an ABN. So many acronyms, and there are ways you can find out about applying for an ABN. Again, it doesn't cost anything, through the Australian Business Registry, the ABR. Again, you'll have links to all of these in the information. So we're coming up to 7 o'clock. What a lot of information. And again, I'll pause for questions. We've covered a lot in our 4 weeks together. We have looked at employers, who they are, where to find them, what they want, what they're looking for from employees. We followed that in week 2 with how you build a resume that really stands out, so that employers, when they're looking at it, are going to think, oh, this person looks super interesting and right for the job that I've advertised. Last week, we talked about interviews and what to do. So much information about how you prepare and what you can say and what you don't need to say, and what you maybe shouldn't say when you're in an interview. And today we've talked about rights and responsibilities as a worker. And as always, as the previous weeks have gone, there's just so much information. And these sections really have been, these sessions together have been signposting you for you to go away and find out more information yourself, because it's all out there on the internet, and there are lots of people that can help you. So I really wish you the best of luck with your job search, getting ready for work, finding work that you enjoy and that pays you a good wage. And you, of course, will have access to our resources after this session. So thank you so much for joining us, and maybe see you again soon. I'll leave if there's any final comments or observations from Morland. All right, I'm going to sign off now. Cheers, everyone. Thank you.